Hello and welcome everybody on this sunny Sunday, July 12th, 2026. Well, sunny in Canada. Uh, uh, and let me start off with a little bit about Swar-Akshar. Swar-Akshar is a Canada-based literary and cultural organization founded and run by Neeta and Shailesh. Based in Mississauga, the organization is dedicated to promote Gujarati language, literature, arts, and meaningful cultural dialogue through literary programs, discussions, performances, and digital platforms. We started our journey approximately 3 decades ago. However, we went on to use the virtual meeting platforms, or you can say unified communications platform, about 6 years ago. And as we all know, literature and arts don't have boundaries of languages. We have broadened our horizon and conduct our programs in English and Hindi also. Swar-Akshar serves as a bridge between literary traditions and contemporary thought, creating spaces where writers, scholars, artists, translators, and audiences can engage with literature, cinema, philosophy, and cultural ideas. At Swar-Akshar, as part of our indulgence into occasional explorations into moving image, we welcome our guest, Sarunas Pokanis, Erin O'Donnell, Ashish Avikuntak, and Amrit Gangar. Let me go through or briefly say how we are going to run today's episode. We'll start with introduction, and once the introduction is done, we'll have a film by Amrit Gangar, followed by Amrit Gangar's discourse on cinema Prayoga, and he'll be reading some excerpts from the book that is in the middle of our discussion today. And then we'll have Sarunas, Erin, and Ashish giving their thoughts. And once the guests have given their thoughts and shared their thoughts, we'll go into Q&A. Unless any of our guests is willing to say, hey, we can go, informal and have Q&A during their discourse, we are fine. But let's keep it this way and then take it from there. So Sarunas Pokanis is a professor and head of digital culture, communication and media research group, Faculty of Social Sciences, Arts and Humanities, Kaunas University of Technology in Kaunas, Lithuania. His current research interests include new media, Indian cinema, artificial intelligence, cultural theory, post-humanism, and post-colonial theory. He's an author, editor, and co-editor. Erin O'Donnell is an associate professor of history at East Stroudsburg University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests are Indian, Bengali, Bangladeshi films, and photography. Besides working on the films of Ashish Avikuntak, she has also written about the cinema of Ritwik Ghatak. She is currently developing a project on the American photojournalist Margaret Burke White. Ashish Avikuntak is a filmmaker, cultural anthropologist, and archaeologist. His films, known for their philosophical depth and formal rigor, explore ritual, temporality, and Indian epistemology. Since the mid-1990s, his work has been featured at major international venues. Avikuntak's cinema challenges conventional narrative structures, offering a contemplative and politically engaged vision of Indian modernity. He is an author and is now a professor of film media at the University of Rhode Island. Mr. Amrit Gangar, who is an author, film scholar, theorist, historian. He has an unusual command over both the languages, English and Gujarati. He has written in both the languages. He was awarded Lifetime Achievement Award by Taramati Vishanji Foundation. The International Federation of Film Clubs in Berlin and the Federation of Film Societies of India have awarded him for his imaginative movement. He was also invited by the Government of India to be the consultant curator and the National Museum of Indian Cinema. The consultant curator and the content development for the National Museum of Indian Cinema, the first museum in the country. He has curated film programs for national and international film festivals. Once again, we welcome all of you, and we'll get on with the film. Unless, Amrit, do you want to say anything, or we start the film?
You need to unmute yourself, Amrit bhai.
I had shown this film at Pondicherry conference, which was curated and organized by Sarunas, in fact, and his friends. Ashish Savikuntak had delivered a wonderful, thought-provoking keynote address there in Pondicherry, French Institute. So this is about space, the film. And then I will talk a little about Cinema Prayoga, which includes about the film also, some comments. So we can start the film. Just wanted to say that this was shown at Pondicherry.
Right. And
Erin has not seen it, but Sarunas and Ashish had seen it. Erin, there's so much of Ritvik Ghatak continuously all through about space. You will see it.
That night he had a dream. He was on a boat with fishermen. What was he doing fishing in the middle of the sea, in the middle of the night? He didn't even know how to swim. Him and the fisherman, we are in that boat in the mid-sea, he thinks. He can hear the voices of other fishermen calling. He can see he's not a fisherman. Him and the fisherman, him and I, are in that boat in the mid-sea. Later in the dream, the part he doesn't remember well, the boat develops a crack. He feels the fear of a watcher. The fishermen, like surgeons, repair the crack and check the boat plank by plank. Many years later, whenever he thinks of the dream, he always remembers it as beginning in the middle of the sea, where he finds himself with the fisherman. How and why, he doesn't know. The end is always moving towards the shore. Today he thinks of the middle and repair, and of tradition and dharma.
பெரிய ஸ்பீச்செல்லாம் கொடுக்க மாட்டான். வாஜஸ்ரீ போடையா, வாஜஸ்ரீ போடையா போடுதோ அப்படிங்கிற பேனா வச்சு வச்சு பேப்பர் எடுத்து ஒரு பல்லு 8 நிமிஷம் சொல்லுவார். நோட்டேஷனும் எழுத முடியாது, அப்படி எழுத முடியாது. அது எல்லாம் மனதில் ஞாபகம் வச்சு பாரு, அதை பாரு, இதை பாரு, அந்த இப்படி விடுவார் பாருங்க. இப்படி ஒரு 2-3 நாளைக்கு அவர் ஓரி ஆடி எல்லாம் பண்ணி ஒரு மாதிரி ஷேப் கொடுத்து, அப்புறம் ஃபங்க்ஷனுக்கு ரொட்டேஷன்லாம் அம்மாவுக்கு ஒரு கொடுக்கணும்ல, ஃபேஷனால வீட்டு கொடுத்தாக்கா இங்கே ஒரு ரஃப் காப்பி கிட்டே இருக்கு. அவருக்கு பார்த்தேன், அவங்க பார்த்தேன், எப்படியோ ஒப்பிச்சுட்டோம். அதுக்கப்புறம் தான் இப்போ ஏதோ எல்லாம் வச்சுருக்காங்க, பாடுற வச்சுருக்கோம். அது அப்படி பண்ணேன். இந்த வாய்ச்சாக எல்லாம் சொல்லிருக்காங்க தெரியாதவங்க.
ঠিক আছে, তবে আমায় বলতে দাও, তুমি কি জানো রাম রাবণকে হত্যা করেনি, ওটা একটা ভাওতা। আসলে সীতা রাবণকে ভালোবেসে ফেলেছিল, রামের থেকেও বেশি। সীতা চাইতো রাম ও রাবণ দুজনের সঙ্গেই সহবাস করতে, আর তাই দুনিয়াকে বোকা বানাতে রাম রাবণ হত্যার মিথ্যা প্রচার করে। আর সেজন্যই সীতা হনুমানের সঙ্গে আসেনি, বরং তিনি তখন মোহিত রাবণে, পূর্ণ নিমজ্জিত তার প্রেমে। তার ভালো লাগে 100 আঙুল, 20খানা বলিষ্ঠ হাত, পৌরুষময় দশানন। আসলে রাম রাবণকে পছন্দ করত, কেননা সীতা তাকে পছন্দ করত। রাবণের শৌর্যবীর্য অস্বীকার করা যায় না।
তার ভালো লাগে যখন সে তার 10 মাথা, 20 হাত আর 100 আঙুল নিয়ে ভালোবাসতে থাকে তাকে। প্রথম প্রথম বাধা দিলেও পরে তার ভালো লাগতে থাকে। সে শিউরে ওঠে একসাথে 10 স্থানে চুম্বন স্পর্শে। ভাবো, 10 ওষ্ঠ চুম্বন করছে তোমায়, তোমার পায়ের পাতা, গোড়ালি, পায়ের গোজ, উরু, নাভি, যোনি ছিদ্র, পায়ুস্থান, উন্নত স্তন, সুডৌল পাছা, ওষ্ঠ, অধর, চক্ষু, কর্ণ, কপাল, সর্বত্র একই সাথে একই সময়। তার 10 ঠোঁট নড়ে চড়ে বেড়ায় সারা শরীরময়, শরীর জুড়ে এখানে আর ওখানে। সীতা এটাই চাইতো। শিহরণে তুঙ্গ শীর্ষে পৌঁছে যেত সে যখন 10খানা জিহ্বার ক্রমাগত লেহনে সিক্ত হতো সে। আমিও পছন্দ করি, যে কোনো মেয়ে মানুষেরই পছন্দ হবে এটা।
Thank you very much. This triggers, first of all, the end, a thought about my book. It's Sugri Shabri Cinema. Sugri is a weaving bird or weaver's bird. And Shabri is the Adivasi woman who lived in a forest and who fed Ram with berries, but not before tasting them. She gave Ram the berries only which were very tasty. Otherwise, she didn't give him. So this Shabri is, I think, the most devoted Ram Bhakt, you can say. Ram is in news nowadays. But this book comes to my mind because of Erin O'Donnell. Erin O'Donnell wrote a blurb on the back side of the book. This is a Gujarati book. She wrote in English. And towards the end, it resonates to me. The term that she used, cellular stupor. She uses this word, cellular stupor. And this is exactly the state we are perhaps living in. Overdose of the information or data or whatever has turned us into a vegetative state, a kind of static. The image that we are constantly encountering or seeing has become static. It has lost the dynamic, or that's what I refer to, dynamism of the analog or the photographic image even. So it has become very static and inert. So this is the state where it's a collective apathy. This we are facing all the time in our society. No matter you go on fasting for 20 days or 25 days, state doesn't care. So it's also a question whether state as an institute exists. It's a serious question that we are facing today. Where is the state? What kind of state we are living in? This again is the question of space that we have created for us. And it's a serious question that Cinema Prayoga would question. I thank Erin O'Donnell for using this cellular stupor, which exactly the state where we question. I thank Swar-Akshar to pull these minds together on this platform. So virtually, these three minds, excellent minds and very beautiful and very thinking mind that we have together with us. Let me talk about what is Swar-Akshar. It's not just a portmanteau word. Swar is the musical note. And Dhwani, it combines Dhwani with it. And Akshar is the letter, Akshara. It is abstract molecule, you can say. And this two combined together makes Swar-Akshar. And that combination resonates again with Prayoga. The term Prayoga to me is also very dynamic in the sense that pra here becomes an engine. Pra is an engine which pulls or pushes the yoga I will explain what yoga is here. The and how it pushes forward. It's a progressive term, progressive concept, progressive theory of practice, as Ashish Avikuntak says. It's a theory of practice. Prayoga, engine. If I give an example of another word, pragati. Gati is motion. When I say pragati, it becomes forward motion. It moves forward. And that includes the sense of avant-garde. So I don't use the word avant-garde. Prayog includes that. Avant-garde is basically a word coming from military. It's a defense word. Front-ranking soldiers. So my civilization doesn't prefer to use any military word, which again concerns space today. This whatever is happening today is division of space. Is because of space is polarized. Space is divided. It happens. Even the space in the sky, Akash, it's divided. This particular country doesn't allow your airplanes to enter their space. Now, where this ownership of space came in, we don't know. This whole idea of ownership, that is questioned by this dynamic term or dynamic concept called cinema prayog, which again shakes the cellular stupor. The cellular stupor was massively disturbed or shaken by Ashish Avikuntak in this book edited by Erin O'Donnell and Sarunas Ponkslis. This is the book which we are going to talk about. And this is the book which often talks about cinema prayog in a way, which is actually very encouraging and which enthuses me. And this conference that you have organized, Nita Ben, Nita, and Silas, that all these minds have come together today. And this is what we are going to discuss. Cinema of Prayoga. Yoga is a sandhi. Yoga in Sanskrit origin, etymology, comes from the root yuj. Yuj is the yoke, which yokes or combines or joins together certain ideas or concepts. And Prayoga is forward motion or forward moving yoga. Yoga is this sense I'm taking. Even Prayoga is a very common word in all Indian, on modern and ancient languages, but to me, it has certain different significance. Prayoga, the full term, and that's why cinema prayoga I came upon this idea many years ago. Actually, it roots lies in one of my program notes of Screen Unit, the film society that I ran. This idea actually emerged or got birth in 1989, 2nd of September. This is where I question all the Western or terms which had questionable, because cinema has come from the West. Therefore, it is the West that has given us the vocabulary. Cinema Prayog would like to change this vocabulary for the common benefit of humanity, actually. Much loaded word, but this actually happened more than 40 years ago. India had organized a very significant event 35 years ago. It's on space. It's most significant event, I think, of 20th century. In 1991 in Delhi. It was conceived and organized by Kapila Vatsyayan. It's such an important event where all the countries, all the civilizations and cultures met together in Delhi and talked about space, only about space. This important event is not taken, I think, proper cognizance. This event was, I think, one of the most significant events in the world, which world should take the note of. We are taking note of only the wars. we are talking constantly about war. What is this? Why are we fighting? This question also, I think one of the main reason is the space. We divide space. The division of space immediately becomes ownership issue. An ownership issue leads to wars, conflict. This conflict, I think, is has to be addressed seriously by filmmakers. I don't use the word filmmaker, I call filmkar, like Sangeetkar or Chitrakar. So this Ashish Avikuntak is one of the most important artists of our time. He wrote, before this book, he wrote a book called Bureaucratic Archaeology. And this is a very important book. Bureaucratic Archaeology that he wrote is an important book that he produced. This is the book he wrote. And this, I think I combined this book along with the book Erin and Sarunas edited. And this book talks to us many insights into the minds. You know, who does he dedicate this book? He dedicates the book for the unknown laborers in the archaeological trances of India. He worked as an archaeologist at Dodavira in Kutch. And he dedicates the book to those laborers who worked in the trances. It's not archaeology, it's a tough thing to do. But without those laborers, you can't do anything. So this is the book he dedicates. These are the issues, and we are now eager to listen to three of them, Sarunas, Erin O'Donnell, and Ashish Avikuntak. Their thoughts I'm sure, will shake up this cellular stupor, which has become collective cellular stupor, collective apathy that we are facing today. Thank you very much, and I hope I threw some light on the question of space and cinema Prayoga. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amrit. And that's a great start to a good discussion with a little bit of technological hiccup. Thanks, Sarnas, for pointing it out. I will give the mic over to Sarnas to go over, followed by Erin and Ashish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to read certain bits and pieces from the chapter from the book that Amrit referred to, which is edited by Erin and me. And I will just read some thoughts about both the work of Ashish Avikuntak and Cinema Prayoga, the way I interpret it, the way I understand them. So Ashish's films are challenging, uncomfortable in a sense that they pose an epistemic challenge to the spectator. What is the source of the challenge, of the discomfort? To tackle this question in my talk, I would like to reflect on the notions of decoloniality, epistemic archaeology, cinema of Prayoga, as well as tantric practice, as this offers ways in understanding the complexity and importance of Ashish's work. In an interview that he gave to Erin and me, Ashish termed his filmmaking practice as both epistemic archaeology as well as cinema Prayoga. This indicates very different epistemological positions compared to what many other independent or experimental filmmakers engage in. As Avikuntak states, he takes epistemic refuge in cinema Prayoga. Cinema Prayoga does not rely on Western theoretical positions related to cinema, and in my mind, it invokes radical aesthetics that challenge Western cinematic epistemology by offering philosophical entry points into cinematic theory and practice that are distinctly indigenous, that is, developed before or even in opposition to modernity. But far from rejecting modernity, Avikuntak, through his cinema, brings out the silenced and distorted voices of indigenous religious culture, not yet transformed by coloniality and the post-colonial condition, and attempts at transforming modernity itself. Avikuntak sees his films as a political response to post-colonial modernity. But crucially, his is not post-colonial filmmaking. Postcolonial thought, in terms of its arsenal of tools employed in writing back to the empire, as it were, finds its origins in European philosophy and modernity. This methodologically keeps a postcolonial thinker bound to coloniality, as Latin American decolonial theorists like Aníbal Quijano or Walter Mignolo claim. In his cinematic project, Avikuntak is closer to Latin American decolonial thinkers and practitioners than to South Asian postcolonial theorists, something that his statements make clear in our book's interview. His cinema is decolonial rather than postcolonial, and his decoloniality arises from several sources: from his mode of production, from the style employed in his films, as well as from the themes of the films. With all of his films, he attempts to excavate pre-colonial and pre-modern knowledge in an archaeological sense, hence the notion of epistemic archaeology. This is Avikuntak's decolonial praxis, and this is where his training both as an archaeologist and a filmmaker converge. This praxis can also be understood as cinema prayoga. I'd like to spend a moment in order to unpack the notion of decoloniality, which I use several times, in order to show how it relates to Avikuntak's work. The concepts of coloniality and decoloniality emerged in Latin America in the 1990s and offer an alternative view than that of postcolonial theory. Avikuntak's ideas resonate with an approach to colonialism and strategies of resistance introduced by Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, which began the debate on decoloniality predominantly in the Latin American context. The idea stems from attempts to understand the pervasive effects of colonialism, from experiences of modernity, from forms of knowledge that modernity located outside its epistemic fold, the story of modernity that has been, quote, constantly hiding and repressing what doesn't fit the imaginary and desires of storytellers, end of quote, according to Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh. Decoloniality admits that the crucial methodological move of liberating knowledge is delinking it from knowledge imposed by the coloniality/modernity dyad. A decolonial practitioner, whether an activist, an insurgent, or an artist, would fall back on local, indigenous knowledge and work from what Mignolo terms as the border. Border thinking to him is essentially a hybrid, non-dualistic mode of knowledge production, as he says, a new epistemological modality at the intersection of Western and the diversity of categories that were suppressed under Occidentalism, Orientalism, and area studies. End of quote. The first step of decoloniality, therefore, is to move out of the fold of knowledge that is considered dominant and hegemonic and into the space of repressed indigenous knowledge. In my view, Avikuntak's cinematic praxis is precisely a case of decolonial delinking. It is an attempt at thinking and acting from an epistemic border in challenging what Boaventura de Souza Santos terms as epistemicide, a murder of indigenous knowledge perpetrated first by the colonial and second by the postcolonial structures of power. This Avikuntak performs by utilizing two epistemic tools. First, as a cinema prayoga practitioner, he uses a non-normative cinematic mode to destabilize the epistemic hegemony of experimental cinema in the Western sense of the term. Second, his cinematic mode involves tantric knowledge, often distorted and marginalized both in the popular imagination and postcolonial context. First, let's look at cinema of prayoga as a decolonial theory of praxis. If we were to think about Avikuntak's cinema from inside the fold of disciplinary discourses related to art and film studies, most likely we would engage in imposing a conceptualization derived from the epistemic positions of the global north. Thus, such cinema would be categorized as independent or experimental. But such an understanding would take us far from grasping the essence of Avikuntak's cinema. We would attempt to understand a very different language using our preconceived notions of what constitutes the grammar and the vocabulary of his cinema. Such a position would inevitably be both an effect of and the manifestation of our own coloniality of knowledge. We need different kinds of theoretical tools in order to grasp such theory of practice that Avikuntak, as he himself calls it, is engaged in. And the concept of Prayoga is precisely such a decolonial border type concept. Amrit Gangar, the author of this concept, adopts a Sanskrit term Prayoga, and he introduces this term, as he says, as a better alternative to English experimental. As Gangar explains in his many writings on the subject, the term experimental, as it is understood in the West, refers to unintended consequences of a particular action where one who acts, a scientist or an artist, does not clearly envision the outcome of the practice. According to Gangar, this is not the case when it comes to cinema. For this reason alone, the term experimental is deeply flawed. What I am mostly interested in, however, is another important layer of opposition to this term, its questionable universal applicability. The universality of this and many other terms, ideas, and theories that comprise knowledge historically was decided by power relations when it came to knowledge production, and these relations formed during colonial times. In this case, as many scholars working on questions of postcoloniality or decoloniality have been arguing for decades, from the colonial standpoint, knowledge was formed on this side of the line separating the colonizer and the colonized, in order to understand, categorize, or dismiss knowledge production on the other side. Prayoga, therefore, offers ways to understand Indian cinematic practice on its own terms, without blind allegiance to Western film theory, and by supplementing theory with indigenous terms and knowledge. Cinema of Prayoga itself is the practice which is not only outside the fold in terms of Euro-American knowledge production, but also internally, as it locates filmmakers that are outside the mainstream commercial cinema, beyond what is variously categorized as independent art or slow cinema. Avikuntak calls himself a Mahua filmmaker, one that is outside the commercial circuits of cinema market. Prayoga filmmakers, therefore, are doubly displaced on the ultimate margins of cinematic production, both locally and globally. Although Gangar argues that Prayoga is not a political concept, or as he says, it is non-military as a word, I'm trying to argue the opposite. Prayoga is first and foremost political, a defiant and radical attempt to subvert the coloniality that exists deeply embedded in the discipline of film studies once it turns its Western eyes to non-Western cinema. Out of these complexities, we can distinguish several layers of thought if we were to locate Avikuntak cinematically and politically as an artist activist existing outside the multiple folds. I would like to, for strategic reasons, invoke Akira Lippitt's positions towards experimental cinema despite its Eurocentric genealogies. Lippitt's interpretation of experimental cinema as Exar and as ex-cinema through Derrida and Nietzsche is quite inspiring and may help to pave the way towards an understanding of Prayoga. Ex-cinema is, quote, the thought and practice of cinema outside. The works that comprise ex-cinema are essentially outside without demanding primacy, end of quote. Experimental is understood as practice outside of what is accepted, necessarily marginal. Understanding experimental cinema and experimental art in general, for that matter, as marginal can be effective, just as it may be useful to locate such cinema within the logic of rebellious post-structuralist interventions that in their own right have had tremendous influence on post-colonial theory. However, dismantling the coloniality of the medium and the discipline in the most radical way would be to delink it from Euro-American theory, not to dismiss it altogether, but to bring into the conversation the theory and praxis itself, that itself is outside the conventional theory and praxis of the discipline and the cinematic art. As Lippitt claims, quote, an excerpt locates an outside space that is included in the work as its outside, end quote. Prayoga, therefore, can be understood as part of, first of all, film theory as its outside, but simultaneously as part of it, as a supplement in Derridean sense of the term, a frame which is a part of the work, but on the margins at the border. And second, as praxis which is outside of cinema, beyond the dualities of mainstream and art. This is precisely what decoloniality as a concept is attempting to bring out. The border, which is an alternative silenced knowledge intervening into a hierarchical knowledge space. Such an alternative is not necessarily trying to overtake the hegemony and thus become hegemonic itself, but by acting as a supplement to it, it transforms the whole raison of a particular field of knowledge. And this corresponds to Gangar's ideas about what Prayoga is. Becoming a supplement to hegemonic knowledge, in effect, deconstructs the essence of hegemony. Such becoming excerpt can also be seen as delinking, as decoloniality in its essence is the possibility to delink local knowledge from the dominance of global designs. What is important in the decolonial project is that it does not distinguish theory from praxis. Decoloniality, as Walsh claims, is contextual, relational, practice-based, and lived. She terms this praxis as decolonial insurgency, which can mean anything that challenges the normative discourse. Therefore, we can see cinema of Prayoga as well as work of Avikuntak as a manifestation of such decolonial insurgency, specifically an aesthetic insurgency. Examples of epistemic delinking or insurgency in Avikuntak's films are abundant. His early short film, Dancing Othello, is a good illustration of an attempt to complicate the conversation by blending modernity with indigenous knowledge into a seamless whole, and without juxtaposition that would necessarily reproduce an East-West binary. This film, as Avikuntak states, is a political film and aims quote, to subvert both the traditions of classical art to bring out the irony of the postcolonial situation, end of quote. It fuses two distinct art forms, Kathakali and Shakespearean drama. Although Avikuntak claims that he attempts to juxtapose the two, I argue that the film goes beyond juxtapositions. Kathakali and the performance that we are witnessing, or the postcolonial mimesis, as Avikuntak claims, supplements the classical Shakespearean drama and thereby subverts it. In Dancing Othello, the decolonial insurgency can be observed at its best. But his later work, where he more firmly engages with tantric practices, emerges as a highly nuanced decolonial praxis. Tantra is another key aspect of Avikuntak's cinema. He does not represent Tantra in his films, he performs it. Cinema is his sadhana, as he claims. Tantra, a religious practice, a corpus of indigenous knowledge distorted, misrepresented, maligned, marginalized by both colonial power as well as post-colonial rationality, has itself become a decolonial praxis. During the colonial period, Tantra for Orientalist scholars became the embodiment of the other, vis-a-vis the mainstream Brahminic traditions that collectively came to be labeled as Hindus. The West projected onto Tantra its most profound fears, and in turn, the colonized engaged with such an imagining by producing their own representations. For example, by invoking Tantra in anti-colonial struggle in late 19th century Bengal. The otherness for the West resided in ritual practices that were seen as transgressive and grotesque, like sexual intercourse, usage of body fluids, etc. This knowledge was interpreted as dangerous, perverted. As for the British, it came to symbolize the otherness of India. During the colonial period and after, Westernized elites in India continued employing such distorted imagination. For the purpose of my paper, I can state that Tantra is a good example of epistemicide. Avikuntak performs an act of epistemic archaeology in resurrecting the othered knowledge in his films. He does not represent the knowledge, he liberates it. If, to quote Mignolo, decoloniality is first and foremost liberation of knowledge, of understanding and affirming subjectivities that have been devalued by narratives of modernity, then the attempts to represent Tantra, or in many literary and cinematic instances to engage with it, function squarely within the colonial matrix of power. These are, to paraphrase Mignolo, examples of being used by the imaginary of modernity. The aim of the decolonial project, however, is to reverse such an order of things and to use the imaginary of modernity to subvert its colonial essence. He terms this as re-existing. And Abikuntak, through his praxis, performs precisely such re-existing. For example, in Namanush Premer Kotamala, Glossary of Non-Human Love, Abikuntak engages for artificial intelligence, which in the 21st century as a topic has become arguably the pinnacle of modernity. But in his signature style, he uses the imaginary of modernity by complicating it with tantric epistemologies, thereby dislocating the supremacy of modern technological knowledge, usually it's there at the center in such cases. With this film, he demonstrates that one doesn't need to be guided by modernity in order to think about artificial intelligence without denying the fact that in the end, one needs to use the tools of modernity. For example, technological devices that are absent in the film in order to engage with AI. Abikuntak himself thinks of, quote, Tantra as a powerful imagination that consists of heterogeneous technologies of diverse practices to engage with the non-human, from the divine to the inanimate, to affect the human within, end of quote. Understanding Abikuntak's work in this context, and especially as a decolonial praxis, unlocks a deeper political meaning of many of his films, where indigenous knowledge and ideas, as well as contemporaneity, modernity, and everyday life blend into an amalgam, hybridizing past and present. Such a seamless amalgam, I would argue, is precisely the logic of decolonial critique. And the form such critique takes in this context is epistemic archaeology, excavating, recovering, and remembering knowledge that has been erased, supplanted, written over by the colonial matrix of power. In decolonial logic, the space where decoloniality is performed is the border, a space which is outside the colonial as well as Orientalist fold. And the logic of the border does not attempt to distill any kind of indigenous purity from the historically constructed dialectic image. Knowledge produced within the border, as I mentioned, refuses to be informed squarely by the knowledge that is deemed acceptable. It accepts the dialectic nature of the image that has reached its present form, and contrary to any attempts to cleanse it from colonial influences, it exposes the colonial matrix of power by positioning itself against any hegemonic positions. Such an amalgam that counters coloniality is found in many of Ashish's films. Thank you very much for your attention.
That's fantastic, Sarunas. You took Abikuntak's films, all the aspects almost, and talking about decoloniality compared to post-coloniality. That's beautiful, and also talking about cinema Prayoga. So excellent. Thank you very much, and we will get on with Erin. Erin, welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'm just going to read a few pages from the beginning of my chapter. And I think, though, it obviously ties in, particularly with what Amrit was talking about in terms of our current state of the viability of the state and the destructiveness of the state, particularly in relationship to space. And so I think there'll be some synchronicity, obviously, with some of the first few pages of my chapter. So thank you. And the chapter is entitled Ashish Avikuntak's Cinema of Dissent in an Authoritarian Age. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Ashish Avikuntak's Rati Chakravu, 2013, Kalki Mantan Kota, The Turning of Kalki, 2015, Apot Kalin Trikalika, The Kali of Emergency, 2016, Vrindavani Vairagya, Dispassionate Love, 2021, Namanush Premier Kotamala, Glossary of Non-Human Love, 2019, and Vidvasta, Devastated, 2022, are all feature films completed and released during the rise and consolidation of power of the Hindu nationalist regime of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. How these feature films operate within and against the authoritarianism of India's political, economic, and social cultural systems and institutions is paramount to understanding how radical artistic praxis must exist and operate in an era of Hindu and global ultra-nationalisms in the early 21st century. As Yale philosopher, formerly of Yale, Jason Stanley put forth in the introduction to his How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, quote, fascist politicians justify their ideas by breaking down a common sense of history and creating and he bolds this, mythic past to support their vision for the present, end quote. This essential foundation of public life, quote, a common sense of history, end quote, has been consistently eroded during the Hindu nationalist-fueled Modi regime from 2014 until the present. Indian historian Ramala Thapar has discussed the importance of dissent in Indian history as a form of resistance against the reification of India as a narrowly defined Hindu political religious state. She argues for radical, rational, philosophical, very important here, dissent to counter this exclusionary nationalism. Avi Kuntuk's films, specifically the 6 features I started trying to articulate, are analyzed in various ways in this chapter, are philosophically and phenomenologically dissenting creative works that both frontally and obliquely critique India's socio-historical body politic through the construction of a somatic cinema that embodies hearing, seeing, and feeling through language, sound, music, and the presentation of a prominent corporeality of characters. This cinematic density strives to produce a sense and senses of history in the present and to generate diegetic spaces where the divine, the sacred, and the human, the mundane unequivocally forefront and confront what is at stake in the current historical moment. When dangerously potent and seductive religio-techno-corporate authoritarianisms have once again taken root around the world. What do I mean by dissent in terms of Avi Kuntuk cinema? The etymology of dissent, from Latin dissentere, to withhold assent or approval, from dis, apart, and centere, to feel, provides a footing for what this chapter aims to explore. That Avi Kuntuk's films are conceived, constructed, and distributed in spite of the current, often oppressive political, economic, cultural, and environmental conditions that exist in our present, both in India and throughout the world. These films exist. They provoke. They intrigue. They are mysterious in an age of stifling autocratic certainty. They engender sensuous feeling in a frequently coarse, brutal age. Avi Kuntuk's marriage of Prayoga, as certainly Amrit and Sarunas have dipped into this, Avi Kuntuk's marriage of Prayoga and Tantric, which I discuss later in the chapter, but won't articulate too much here. And Tantric practice serves as the bedrock of this dissent. The term Prayoga was first employed in 2005, although we learned today, much earlier, conceived by Amrit. In 2005 by Amrit Gangar, Indian film theorist and historian, who obviously has a wonderful chapter in our volume as well, in the context of the Experimenta Festival Mumbai and with the subsequent publication titled The Cinema of Prayoga. As I have similarly stated elsewhere, Prayoga cinema art can be defined as a practice, drawing from Indian rasa, essence, bhava, being, becoming, Andalusian theoretical languages and landscapes, to name only 2 arenas. A categorization and a descriptive to enable a movement or movements, as Saruna said, beyond the restrictive Euro-Americentric binds of the terms parallel, experimental, underground, avant-garde, art, middle, regional, alternative, and new wave. Recognizing Avikuntuk's grounding in a Prayoga sensibility and practice, I go on in this chapter to analyze the how and why of his cinema's direct and indirect engagement with and critique of India's past and present, diverse and complex historical, political, religious, and cultural landscapes as a bulwark against and counter to Hindu nationalisms, Hinduvas, maddening reductionism, and certitude. And this next little part is particularly grounding in thinking about history. Whose history? In this first section, as well as in the second, I will examine different instances of Avikuntuk articulating and intersecting with various moments of Indian history in his films, with the aim to address how, why, authoritarian regimes, specifically the Hindutva, rather benign translated as Hinduness, infused Modi government, how they represent, present, and manipulate history, and how this director opposes these dangerous machinations in his cinematic constructions. In his recent work, going back to Jason Stanley, Stanley uses the term supremacism to describe a polity's slippery slide toward fascism and outlines the main educational pillars emphasized in fascist regimes like Nazi Germany, which include, quote, national greatness, national purity, national innocence, strict gender roles, and, of course, vilification of the left, end quote. As Talpa reminds us, concerning the root of the ongoing myopic interpretation of Indian history, particularly when she focuses on the long-term deleterious impact of James Mill's 1817 or Orientalist, The History of British India, quote, she says, the British version of Indian history, what was in effect their historiography of India, was the kind of history that professional historians saw and see as an attempt to whittle down every cause to a single one, religious difference, and ignore or minimize other causes, end quote. A direct through line can be made from the British colonialist curtailment and fabrication, at times certainly, of Indian history, to the groundwork laid and actions undertaken, beginning in the 1920s by the ideological father of Hindutva, V.D. Swar-Akshar, with his support and elaboration of the idea of India as a Hindu Rashtra, Hindu nation, and the subsequent formulation of the ultranationalist Hindu organization, the RSS, which is only accelerated into the 21st century with the national ascendancy to power of Modi and the BJP. As Tanika Sarkar pointedly underscores, quote, RSS history is driven by political needs, popular beliefs, and myths and construction of memory work. These imperatives assert their privileges against investigative history, claiming that your history comes in the way of my memory, and relativizing all narratives so that the question of academic evaluation and cross-checking, of ascertaining validity of narrative claims, methods, and purposes do not arise. History becomes a flat field where all kinds of memories have an equally interesting status, end quote. In his book, Bureaucratic Archaeology, that very importantly Amrit brought up earlier, Avikuntuk conducts a richly researched, nuanced excavation of the history and practices of the Archaeological Survey of India, ASI, to ascertain, quote, how the post-colonial state assembles and produces knowledge, end quote. In his conclusion, he emphasizes how, quote, now big science in the form of archaeogenetic data is being assembled to trace an unadulterated genealogy of an Indian past, unambiguously reconstructed as a Hindu identity, end quote. He further, Avikuntuk, significantly notes, quote, succinctly put, the ASI bureaucratic archaeology perpetuates the colonial epistemological project reinforced by an authoritarian bureaucratic regime in a post-colonial ecology. It is this ideological morphology which accentuates the bureaucratic efficacy of archaeology as a scientific craft that gives archaeology, and especially ASI archaeology, particularly during times of ultranationalism, Hindutva, and status hegemony, neoliberal, unparalleled authority in post-colonial India, end quote. All these scholarly observations illuminate Hindutva's majoritarian project of virtually eliminating or modifying any historical element that does not suit their anti-democratic, illiberal goals. Avikuntak cinema overtly and covertly undermines the pernicious signposts and agendas of the Hindu right. Because of in the interest of time, I could go on, but I think your audience would probably like to hear from Ashish and have some Q&A. So I'm going to curtail my original thought and cede the floor to Ashish.
Perfect. Thank you, Erin. Yeah, it was, I think Sarunas started off saying that the word is still Prayoga or cinema Prayoga is political. And
Yes.
You captured the essence very well. And now, as you said, let's hear from Ashish.
Thank you. This is a bit too overwhelming to be part of a discussion in which you are the subject of the discussion. So thank you everybody who made this possible, and also the audience who have taken their time out to generously come and spend to listen to us. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to just read something from a paper that I've just finished, which was based on a talk I gave at Hyderabad for a conference. So this will be published in the next few months. So I'm just going to read, it's a very, very long paper, but I'm just going to read a few sections from it in which kind of articulates certain ideas that especially Sarunas and Erin talk about, especially in the context of my usage of Tantra in my cinema. So before I read, I also want to say that I very strongly feel, and I think I'll reiterate it when I read, I very strongly feel that in order to challenge the political hegemony of Hindutva, we have to differentiate it. We have to differentiate it from Sanatan Dharma. We have to differentiate it from Hinduism, and I think that is very important. My strong feeling is that if we use, let's say, liberal/Marxist terminology to challenge Hindutva, I think it will fail. And I think we have seen such epistemic failure, especially when we are trying to challenge, especially when liberal thinkers have tried to challenge Hindutva, because I very strongly feel that there is an epistemic framework to challenge Hindutva within Hinduism, or what we understand Hinduism in its broader context. And what I would strongly argue is that within Hinduism's most radical epistemic and ontological form, which is the tantric thinking, is intrinsic the critique of Hindutva as a hegemonic, as a divisive, both theological and ideological force in India. So what I will do, I'm just going to read certain section, which is basically a conclusion on the conclusion of an article on what I call the possibility of cinema of religiosity, which is a long thing. But I'm just going to read where I kind of talk about where I come from as a filmmaker, deeply invested in Indian religious tradition. So I'm just going to read. We live in a moment of perpetual modernity from which there is no escape. Even our understanding of non-modernity and pre-modernity remains contained within the hegemonic modernity and is cognized through modern categories. Nothing can escape modernity because all our interpretative intervention have been comprehensively encompassed by modern epistemic framework. It is no longer possible to stand outside of modernity, and when cinema serves as the medium of representation, which is the form that I work, it is no longer, its technological foundation and industrial modes of circulation renders it inherently and unmistakably modern. I would argue that religiosity that I'm invoking in my film constitutes a reconfiguration of past ritual practices rather than any authentic reproduction. I situate my work within a long tradition of commentarial practices in Indian intellectual and religious tradition history, where ancient religiosity in the form of rituals and engagement with sacred is invoked strategically to challenge the present and wrestle with the contemporary in search of a invigorating comprehension of being. This is not mere reinterpretation, retelling, reimagination, or reinvention of traditional material. My practice itself is an act of religiosity, it is devotion, and it is consecration. I think of my work along the lines of sculptors who made temple idols, artists who drew paintings of divinities, and ritualists who presided over elaborate ceremonies. My quest is not to merely excavate, and this is important because the book is called Epistemic Archaeology. In a certain sense, there's an epistemic excavation involved. So I think that my quest is not merely to excavate endangered past, but to enliven it in our present consciousness and make it actively relevant. In short, through my films, I'm infusing the modern with the ancient, creating a synthesis that refuses the linear temporality of progressive modernization. My cinema of religiosity represents, and when I mean by my cinema of religiosity, I mean it's a combination of Tantra and cinema of Prayoga. My cinema of religiosity represents a sustained effort to create cinema that functions as religious experience rather than narrative entertainment. And for those who have seen my films or have read about it, I'm really not interested in entertaining my audience. It's like I am not trying to make films to make money. It's not part of a means of livelihood. Neither it is a means of entertainment. I think of it as a term that I've used and that Soren has mentioned, I think of it as sadhana of a certain kind. And for me, rituals, the very act of making films becomes ritual. And I'm kind of performing a certain ritual configuration in my films. By foregrounding ritual over narrative, temporality over duration, orality over visual spectacle, and mythic over the mythological, I'm attempting to create a cinematic form that escapes the dominant mode of global cinema while remaining thoroughly modern in its technological means. This is not an exercise in nostalgia or cultural preservation, but rather an active engagement with a living religiosity through contemporary cinematic practices. In doing so, I challenge both canonical categorization of Indian religious cinema and the grotesque political appropriation of Hindu religiosity. And what I try to do, I'm offering instead a cinema that operates in multiple religious registers simultaneously and invites viewer into an ontological experience of time, ritual, and being itself. And here I just want to speak about Tantra. This might be a little for those who are not familiar, but this, I want to invoke certain very key genealogy that I come from. Specifically, I employ the theoretical world of Tantra emerging from the theological universe of Kashmir Shaivism. And this is very important to me, particularly as articulated by the Trika and the Krama schools. I'm very happy to talk about the Trik and the Krama school if you're interested. But they're pretty complex, but I don't know if in a short time, however much, but I'll be very happy to explain. This approach exceeds mere aesthetic or thematic concerns. The Trika school emphasizes non-dual nature of reality, and every visual element in my film is composed to invoke this unity, producing an immersive and internally coherent experience. The Krama school, on the other hand, in contrast, foregrounds sequential unfolding of reality and the transformative force of ritual. This perspective shapes my approach to narrative structure, pacing, and framing. I locate in the tantric vision of Trika and the Krama school of the Kashmir Shaivism a radical, non-hierarchical, non-discriminatory philosophical system capable of challenging the political religious violence of Hindutva. Its force derives from an emphasis on inclusion rather than exclusion. Historically, tantric practices have moved across boundaries of caste, gender, religion, intersecting with Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and even later Sufi traditions. This metaphysical openness stands in direct opposition to the rigid demarcation and hierarchy of Hindu theology. Moreover, tantric philosophy affirms the presence of divine in all being, all aspect of existence, making it fundamentally incompatible with doctrines that divide humanity into categories of worth and unworthiness. Within the present cultural and political context, I deploy tantric philosophy in my cinema as a form of resistance. I believe it offers a theological counterpoint to the exclusion of Hindutva. By foregrounding tantric religiosity, my films generate an experience that exceeds purely intellectual argument and engages viewers at multiple levels. This approach unsettles attempts to monopolize the meaning of Hinduism and opens space for alternative embodied understanding of religious life. My films therefore seeks to recuperate and recontextualize symbols that have been appropriated by Hindutva. Reinterpreting these symbols through a tantric lens allows me to challenge the claims of singular authority over tradition. This gesture is not about establishing a rival orthodoxy, but about demonstrating the multiplicity of meaning inherent in Indian religious forms. In my films, the same images and narratives are made to reveal divergent meanings through shifts in framing and context. The resurgence of Hindutva as a political and a cultural ideology lies fundamentally in its insistence on taking the mythological narrative with utmost seriousness as historical and religious truth. For the Hindutva ideologue, myth is not relegated to the category of symbolic or allegorical, but is understood as religion itself possessing concrete ontological status. Mythological narratives are not positioned out of historical time in some forgotten deep past with an archaic manuscript or buried in archaeological remains awaiting discovery. Rather, these narratives are understood as continuous with constitutive reality. As an anthropologist specializing in Indian archaeology, I've observed with considerable concern, and which is what my book is about, how mythological narratives have been systematically excavated, removed from textual and material cultural resources, and subsequently repackaged as empirical facts through the deployment of scientific archaeological methodology. And this is what my book is all about, how archaeology was weaponized in the construction of a past that is fundamentally mythological, that doesn't have any rational historical validity. The Ram Janmabhoomi movement provides perhaps the most dramatic example of such narrative relay operating in contemporary Indian politics. The movement's success in mobilizing millions of support to temple construction at the alleged birthsite of Lord Ram demonstrate with extraordinary clarity the continuing power of religious narrative to shape material reality and transform social environment. In Indian context, myth possess an ontological status and genuine causal power. Mythological facts can be presented as evidence in courts of law, and juridical adjudication informed by these narratives can be deployed to authorize construction of religious architecture. And we are seeing not just in the context of the Ayodhya Ram Janambhoomi, the Ram temple, but now we are seeing in Gyanvapi, we are seeing in Mathura, we are seeing in many, many parts of the country, this similar way mythological narrative is weaponized through archaeology. The mythological then must be taken with utmost seriousness in India and not dismissed as folklore or cultural residue. The success of Hindutva as both political movement and cultural theology lies not merely in organizational capacity or electoral victories, but more fundamentally in successfully epistemically reframing how religious narratives are conceptualized and deployed in Indian public discourse. Hindutva ideologues have deliberately conflated mythological and the real and blurred the distinction between religious narrative and historical fact, between faith-based claims and empirical verifiable evidence. This collapse was not accidental occurrence or unintended byproduct, but rather a deliberate, sophisticated strategy that systematically redefined the nature of legitimate truth claim in Indian public discourse. It is precisely within this fraught historical, political, cultural climate that I locate and justify my cinematographic intervention as both aesthetic and political necessary. I firmly and resolutely foreground my religiosity in my cinematic work, not as an endorsement of religious nationalism, but as a strategic counter discourse. I engage deeply with Hindu religious tradition because if I do not make cinema as a Hindu filmmaker that seriously engages with the complexity and diversity of Hinduism, then Hindutva rhetoric and monolithic interpretation will be universally constructed and accepted as representing a cultural authenticity. The political doctrine of Hindutva stands in fundamental contradiction to the sectarian plurality and heterodox diversity that is inherent and constitutive in the cultural and religious universe of what in modern times have been categorized and consolidated under the single designation of Hinduism. Hinduism as a historical practice has compassed an extraordinary diversity of beliefs, practices, philosophical orientation, devotional tradition, and theological perspective. It has included Shaivas, Vaishnavas, Shaktas, and multiple other deities in divine manifestation. It has accommodated, and this is very important, what we understand in Hinduism has accommodated radically different philosophical schools from dualism, qualified non-dualism, to radical nihilism, from aesthetic Samkhya to theistic Vedantic, and even the antinomian Tantra. These have all been encompassed within what we understand now in contemporary times as Hinduism. It has embraced both ascetic renunciation and worldly engagement, both image worship and iconoclasm, both Sanskrit learning and vernacular devotionalism. This radical heterogeneity and sectarian diversity constitute the actual historical expansiveness of what we now call Hindu religious tradition, and not homogenized, militarized, masculinist, weaponized version promoted by Hindu ideology. Through my cinematic practices, I deliberately and consciously contest Hindutva cultural politics by foregrounding alternative modes of Hindu religiosity rooted fundamentally in contemplation, ritual practices, philosophical inquiry, and devotional plurality. My films, and this is something, again, we can talk about in the context of Tantra. My films engages seriously within Indian religious tradition, texts, rituals, and theological concept, not, as I said earlier, to promote any kind of religious nationalism, but to demonstrate the extraordinary richness and the diversity of these traditions that Hindutva seeks to suppress and homogenize. By creating a cinema of religiosity or a cinema of Tantra or a cinema of Prayoga, it takes Hindu religious experience seriously while refusing communal differences and political instrumentalization. I offer, I believe, an alternative vision of what it means to be a Hindu subject in contemporary India. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashish. That was
Oh, wonderful.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful. And I must say that Swar-Akshar would really, really like to thank all of you, all the speakers and all the participants, that you all have, you all accepted our invitation through Amrit Gangar for sure. And he was a great force in creating this program. And Amrit bhai, you really said in the beginning, and I must say that cognition is so important, and we all have learned through it. And thank you for making sense of Swar-Akshar. It's just not a word. It has some meaning, and thank you for giving it a great meaning. First of all, I would like to say that, I mean, in the interest of time, I wouldn't say much, but it's just a thank you note to all the speakers. And we all, if we all can understand, as Amrit bhai in his film, he said that if we all can understand, and if we all can make some sense out of making symphony out of cacophony around us, that would help us. And how important, Ashish, we thank you very much for all your films, how important it is. And if you all can understand how important the voice of dissent is in these days, and please try to see, understand, and go into the details of what these intellectuals have talked about, and go into the details of it, make sense of it, and understand the Akash. There is space, a lot of space around us. Try to make sense of it and make it from Akash to Chidakash. We all have it. Make use of it, please, and thank you. And if all of you permit us now, we would like to open up the gallery if somebody has some question. I mean, all the participants, we are opening the gallery as always. And if you all have any question, please your hand or virtual hand in that matter, and we will know it. And that way we can invite all of you.
And give me a minute as I open the gallery. We were talking before the program that the technology is always
challenging us.
Give me another second. And there we go.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
If there is any.
When I talked about this, Runa has some question. Can Ashish talk a bit more on Kashmir Saivism? That's
Sure.
this question, her question. Yes. Ashish, for you.
Yeah, thank you, Runa. Runa, that's a very long answer. I think, but in short, I can tell you that in modern times, most of tantric practices were always hidden, in the sense that they were not meant for public, for popular consumption, and lot of written matter, manuscripts, had got lost, or they were not in public circulation. Starting in the early 20th century, especially with the kings in different principal states, especially Baroda, Mysore, and Kashmir, a publication process started of publishing a lot of text, not just tantric, all sorts of text. Out of this, one of the biggest contribution comes from the Kashmir principality state in 19-teens, in around 1917. Kashmir series of texts started, which was one of the first times that many tantric texts, including what is considered to be one of the most important, Tantrilok by Abhinav Gupta, and many others, were being brought out into the public sphere. And the KSTS series produce a few hundred such publication. Most of the publications were without commentary. It was just an attempt at saving the manuscript and getting it published so that it circulates. And then another moment happened a few decades later, nearly about 80 years later, when in Nepal the regime, the royal regime, kind of broke, and the communists came to power. So the royal library at Nepal was made public, which was considered to be a secret repository. And over the last 30 years, there has been a number of these texts have been scanned, and they have been preserved it's in digital world. But what is most important is that there has been a resurgence. I wouldn't say a resurgence, a new breed of really good empirical scholarship has emerged in the last 30 years from the late 1990s, starting from scholars in Oxford and in the US, scholars who have studied with some of the living practitioners of Tantra in Kashmir and a few other places. And they have started doing a very extensive commentarial practice. They have started. And so my own connection personally is that I come from Bengal, which has a very, very, very active and live tantric world, which I participate in. And these new texts that have come out these new commentaries that have come out in the last 30, 40 years have really has given us a very good meaning of what Kashmir Shaivism is. Again, it's, as I said, the term Kashmir Shaivism is a very encompassing term, and it has also been contested by contemporary scholars by saying that the term Kashmir Shaivism is a colonial category. So, but having known that, we are still using it because so therefore, it was important for me to say that within Kashmir Shaivism, you have the Trika school and the Krama school, and there are a few other schools, but I'm very specifically coming from, kind of, let's say, I will not say coming, but those two schools resonate very strongly with the contemporary ontological practices that we see in Bengal today, which I'm associated with. As I said, it'll be a very long discussion, but generally, what I want to say is that there is really important scholarly empirical work that has been produced in the last 30 years, which have really informed our understanding of Tantra in a way which is very, very radical to what it was imagined in the earlier decades.
Thanks. I think Jay has a question. Jay?
I was just referring to the conference on space concept of space, modern and ancient, at which Manikal had presented a paper called Seen from Nowhere. And this questions directly the Renaissance principle of convergence. It doesn't support that principle. And in this, even Ashish Avikuntak in his film, Sati Chakravarti, we saw the excerpt, that resistance to this Renaissance principle continues there. And when I saw the clip from Komal Gandhar, the tracks, the tracking shot, which was also about resistance to this concept of Renaissance principle of convergence. We have this tradition of miniature painting, and Manikal cites the examples of Indian and Persian miniature painting, which doesn't converge, which it doesn't have the perspective of convergence. It has many, many points of convergences actually on a plane. So this is what leads us to polyphony, plurality, as Ashish was talking about, of many views. Like Jain principle of Anekant, for example. I talked about Avgaha. Avgaha is a container, spatial container, which accommodates all spaces, not single space, all kinds of thoughts that contain. Ashish was extremely provocative in a way, and also articulate in his and equally Erin O'Donnell and Sarunas. This has been extremely productive, I would say, uh, congregation of thoughts, which thanks to Swar-Akshar, it happened. Both of you there, we must thank you. I must thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Yeah, I think Jay has a question.
Yeah, hello. Those who are familiar with Amrit Gangarsar, and also he has talked about in the previous episodes of Swar-Akshar, the core principle is cinema of Prayoga, that is the rigor of austerity. And rigor of austerity closely associates with the market, and then market then associates with the hyper-nationalism that we have talked today. So, Ashish ji, can you talk a little bit about how you interpret rigor of austerity, how you implement that in your film, and its relation with market and also the nationalism?
Sure. You know, if you look at the history of cinema as a form of within the history of capitalism, it works like a circle. So, right, you need capital to produce a product, which is cinema. That product is then given to the audience, which is the market. From market, you generate capital, and then capital again goes back to generate the product. And there is this circle that has been generally been the model of what we call cinematic modernity, right from the moment it saw its birth with the Lumiere brothers. The Lumiere brothers were very wealthy capitalists in France, and they had enough money to invent and to produce early works, and that early works were then taken to the market. They were able to get surplus, and that's how cinema started. And with the birth of Hollywood in 1911, 1913, with Griffith, this model then becomes a business model, right? So fundamentally, you're producing product. That product goes to the market. From the market, you are able to sell the product. You generate surplus. That surplus again goes back, and there's this cycle. And that has been the common. I would say that has been the way cinema has been produced in the last 130 years of its nearly 100, about 130, more than 130 years of its life. But there's a problem in the sense there's an aesthetic and a political problem in that cycle, is that the independence of it is a means of entertainment and not a means of art, even however artistic filmmakers are. Even I would say Orson Welles' work, even though it's like exemplary work, was still fed within this cycle of capital market surplus, and so on and so forth. This was historically broken for the first time by the Soviets, because they figured out they were anti-capitalist for obvious reason. So they decided that the state has to produce cinema. And there what happens is that the cinema was used as means of propaganda, right? But they were not really interested in capital and market, because state was going to do the same. The Indian government in 1969 uses the Soviet system. Now, if you look at the history of Indian cinema, starting from Falke, it is caught in that trap. Entertainment, product, capital, surplus, and so forth. And even if you look at religious cinema, either it is by Falke or the majority of Indian silent cinema was religious, it was also within that framework. That here, rather than making a product, it was a product of entertainment. Falke was making a product of religious devotionalism, but it was also part of a capital. And this is something, and I'm going to dovetail into something very provocative in what's happening right now with the corruption mess in Ram Janmabhoomi. So capital is very deeply intertwined with religiosity. But what you see in 1969 is a very interesting moment, is when the state in India, because of Indira Gandhi and her advisors, which also included Satyajit Ray and a few others, they felt that there is a need to break this relationship between cinema and capital. And that is for the first time you have state-supported cinema in India, what we call parallel cinema or the Indian New Wave or any of those terms. And if you look at the history of Indian cinema from 1913, the films made from 1969 to 1996, which is when NFDC, Film Finance Foundation and Film Finance Corporation and NFDC funded film, nearly about 300 films. They are arguably one of the finest work that Indian cinematic modernity has produced in terms of its intellectual and aesthetic merit. Some of the greatest cinema that you see in the last 100 years were produced there, arguably. And so what it does for the first time in India, it breaks the relationship between cinema as a product and market. Market is not important, very much like Soviet Union. Market is not important. You make cinema according to what the state thinks that a filmmaker make. So there's another kind of problem that happens. I don't want to talk about it, but here what you have is film, at least in this period, is ruptured from the market. We can't escape capital. The very fact that we're speaking on Zoom, escaping capital, escaping modernity is not possible. But I think what NFDC does is that we could escape market. Therefore, there was a heightened possibility of the cinematic filmmakers' independence. The way I make film, and this happened in 1996, around the same time when NFDC stops funding films, I start making films. And pretty soon I realized that the only way I could make my films, the way I believe, is that I have to be independent of the market and independent of the state. Because the kind of films I'm going to film is obviously not, I have never been to NFDC. NFDC had already stopped funding, but even if it was around, I don't think so NFDC would have funded any of my films, right? And the market is obviously not interested in this kind of cinema. And then there is a third layer in India, which has been there for the last 100 years, is the layer of censorship, right? Which we see is becoming more and more draconian again. I don't want to talk about that because that's so obvious. What has happened, especially what has happened in the last 1 week in the course of in the case of the film Satluj, right? So there's nothing much to speak about. We know that. But the way I work, and this is, I think, the reason Cinema Prayoga is really important, because Cinema Prayoga, unfortunately, is often by others, when they interpret Cinema Prayoga, they think of it as a means of representation, that there's an aesthetic politics to it. There is a narrative politics. But one of the most important thing is exactly what you said, Jay, is it's rigor of austerity. Cinema Prayoga is also how you produce the film, right? It is how you make the film. And the way I have been making film for the last 30 years now is that it is completely independent. I fund my own films. I do that by working. Before even I came to the US, I worked and I saved money to make my first 2 films. Then I went to the US. For the first 7 years in the US, I was a PhD student. Again, I saved money and made a bunch of 2-3 other films along with my first feature film, which I was just talking to a friend a few days ago, was almost half of my stipend that I saved over half of my total stipend that I got over the course of 7 years. And so that's my model. My model is it's a political model. It's very clear. I understand that the state will not support. I understand that the market is not going to support. Therefore, I have to create my means of production. And I think austerity is the way to go, which is what I speak about, which is what in the interview that Soren has mentioned, which is there in the book, I speak about cinema of Mahua cinema that is produced like Mahua alcohol in Adivasi villages, that is outside market, that is outside the state. It is only meant for people, or the term that Amrit uses very often, Swahirdaya. It is meant for people who are like-minded, and that's where it is supposed to be. And I think my films are also like that. I'm not really interested in making a blockbuster. I'm not interested in becoming a filmmaker and a celebrity. That's not my point. I think my films are demanding, they are challenging, they're not meant for everybody. But for those who are interested, it reaches them. In the same way, those who are interested in drinking Mahua would go to the specific Adivasi village to drink that. And I do that. I mean, I live in Calcutta, but once or twice a year, I would drive down with a couple of friends to one Adivasi village at the border of Bengal and Jharkhand, because they make the best mawa in the world. So I think that's how I think of my cinema.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Extremely interesting. I wanted to ask Ashish, Ashish, on your left, I see photographs, stills.
That was
They
my
are from
question.
Bhuvan Shom, as I see it.
Absolutely.
Which was the first film supposed to be, as journalists say, it was started the new way.
Yes.
Supported by Film Finance Corporation, 1969. The same year, Manikal made the film Uski Roti. Nobody talks about that film except Bhuvan Shom. Why have you put this Bhuvan Shom on your?
No, it's just that it's just it was not a what's the right word? Something that I placed. I go to Chor Bazaar, as you know, Amrit, and I've been my house is full of posters and lobby cards. There's actually there's a very large poster of Mani's Nazar that I found on Chor Bazaar,
Yes.
which has been with me for the last, I think, 12 years. And then the largest poster in my house is Andrei Tarkovsky's Sacrifice, which I have owned for the last, I think, 25 years now. So yeah, the house is full of posters. So there's no specific reason, but you're right.
Okay.
You're right that Bhuvan Shom and Uski Roti both started the parallel cinema, but people often forget about Uski Roti because, again, Uski Roti, I think there's something that we also need to talk about. Uski Roti is demanding cinema. Uski Roti is a challenging cinema. Uski Roti should never, Uski Roti, Manikal, I think I agree. Uski Roti was not supposed to become Sholay ever, right? It's a very specific kind of film for a specific audience. And I think over the last 50 years that it has been, more than 50 years it is there, people who want to see Uski Roti goes to them.
So,
and that's what I believe. I really strongly believe that these filmmakers that I make and the whole cinema Prayog filmmakers, right? You showed the segment from Kabir's film.
Yes.
And Mani and Kumar and Amit and others. I think there are film audiences, people who they reach them, they watch them. I think none of us, I would argue, none of us are really interested in becoming as like Ramesh Sippy or anybody like that.
But you are completely different, Ashish. You practice life.
So true.
The austerity thing, you practice it every morning. You spin yarn on your charkha, petty charkha.
Yes.
And the kind of khadi you are wearing. This practice of living and practice of whatever you are creating through moving image, they're both go together, which is extremely difficult to find.
Thank you.
Yes, and I would totally agree that we should not be discouraged, that we may be a small group, but there are people, and Ashish, you rightly said that whatever one wants to see or hear or read, they do get that and they do read that. So again, once again, very thankful to all of you.
And before we close, I think I'm going to ask one question to Ashish and then one to...
This time has finished.
I know, but we had a little bit difficulty and with the time. So yeah, as I said, last two questions. Ashish, I know you partially answered because the question that I'm going to ask you connect Gandhi's thoughts or philosophy broadly and talk about making films with low budget and small crew. And on the same line, compare films made by Bergman and Tarkovsky, where you are more inspired by, say, Bergman's persona than Tarkovsky's mirror. Can you elaborate a little bit?
No, I'm glad that you asked this question. One of the things the biggest difference between, I wouldn't say Bergman and Tarkovsky, because they were both, what's the right word? They were both industrial filmmakers. So they worked with large crew. If one of the famous shots of Andrei Tarkovsky's most brilliant film and most moving film that we all talk about is Mirror. And there's a shot in the mirror where the mother is sitting, and the doctor comes, and she falls down, and the doctor walks, and there's a big movement of wind that pushes the large grass. That shot, when we saw it, just brought tears of our eyes. It was like a mind-blowing shot. But many years later, I found out, and I was then shown in evidence, that there were 3 army helicopters flying on top to create that wave of grass. So Andrei Tarkovsky was an industrial filmmaker, and I think at that time, and that just not just with Tarkovsky, Bergman was also working within the logic of industrial filmmaking, because that was the only way to make films. And I think the difference between Persona and Mirror is that Persona is a much more austere film, in the sense that Persona was made in Bergman's own hometown, the island that he lived in. It was shot in his own house. So he did, it was more austere in that sense, compared to a brilliant film. I mean, like astonishingly brilliant Mirror, which was made with state mode, which was made industrially. Tarkovsky is famously industrial in the way he mounts his film. It is I would not think of Tarkovsky as an austere filmmaker at all. On the other side, I would think late Godard, Godard in the later year of life, is an astonishing austere film, especially the film he makes in the last 10 years of his life. He would work with very few people. I think that has also a lot to do with the way technology has moved. We have to, as I said, that's what I meant, is that we are modern, we are within modernity, we are within capitalistic situation. It is unescapable. I think even if you go into the forest and being an ascetic, you would probably wear a dhoti which was made in a mill somewhere, right? So I think it's not possible. And I go to Mahakumbh in Allahabad. I've been there two times, which I think one could think of the most austere place, where you would say the most ascetic and the austere people come. But if you go there, you will see it is actually the real opposite. The most. So my point is that capitalism cannot be escaped. We can't escape capitalism. We can't escape modernity. The very fact that we are talking on Zoom, we are live, and it's a moving image. There's a camera, there's sound, there's a whole lots of things. So I think what has happened in the last 20, 30 years is that cinema has become more technologically accessible for people to make films. Today, I have an iPhone, and I can right now shoot a whole feature film on this, which when I made my first feature film, Nirakar Chaya, just the cost of 35mm negative was more than half the cost of the film, close to about $20,000 negative and processing and so forth. So I think we have to understand that digital technology has been liberating for makers. And I think that is something very important to understand. And I think it is possible now to make austere film. But I must admit, I also teach. I teach in America, and sometimes I mentor students in the US. The problem that I see day in and day out is not the technological problem. The problem is the age-old problem of ideas. There is a paucity of ideas. There is almost, what should I say? It's a famine-like situation in the world of cinema in terms of new ideas. Everybody is reinventing old wheel again and again. It's the old wine in new bottle. That it is. I think the situation is the crisis is, as I said, it's an age-old crisis of mind. It is the age-old crisis of ideas, and it is the age-old crisis of thinking. I think it would be incorrect to say, as often some of my peers say, oh, they have cell phone, they're all sitting on their cell phone and watching Instagram. I think every age had its distraction, but every age had its brilliant thinker. And I think we are in that space. So what I try when I work with my student is to teach them to think. I really teach them how to run their cameras. I think you can learn camera watch. You sit on YouTube, you can know how to run a camera and edit a film. I think the problem is that people don't think because it is difficult to think, and it's become more and more difficult to think now.
rather more challenging when you think it's more challenging, so people avoid that.
And the last question, Amrit bhai, to Erin
Yes.
and Sarunas.
I
And
just wanted to say that
sorry.
the question that a young boy who asked Jai Kolia, and he actually made films on mobile phones, a kind of feature-length film he made on a Gujarati poet, Kavikant, 85 minutes long. And he also made 5 variations on Uski Roti. It's extremely interesting the way the younger generation is grappling with this technology and all that. Yes, Saraswati.
Yeah, sorry. So, Sarunas and Erin, either both or any one of you can answer. The question is very basic. How did you get to the title of the book that you edited about Avikuntak's films? Because it captures everything.
Oh, Winds from the East, you mean?
No, the epistemic archaeology of
That Erin already said that.
He
No?
said about Dolavira.
Erin and Sarunas.
Okay. I probably missed that. Sorry. Thank you.
But Winds from the East, actually, I got from Godar.
I was
Godar
about to,
made a
that
film,
title.
Ziga Betov Group, East Wind, it was called. The winds from the east is from that. So they are blowing from the east new ideas and whatever, cinema Prayoga, for example. But what is important, I personally think, and I've been asking, Kashmir Shaivism is so interesting the way Kashi Savikuntak is engaging with. But we have not touched Islamic ideas. Optical, the way the Islam, the world, the West Asia, we call it, has dealt with optics. It's amazing the way they have done. Why have we kept Islamic ideas out of our context or out of our cognizance? This is my question. I always ask. I had written a long article on Al-Kindi. Al-Kindi is a great philosopher, Islamic philosopher, in Etad magazine in Gujarati. But we have to really study the aspects that Islam had invented, dealt with optics, for example. We have to do it seriously. I personally think. I'm not sure whether it has been done already, but whatever knowledge, limited knowledge and information I have, I think that is the gap that we have to grapple with.
Okay, so I think Amrit already had said time up. So thank you very much, Sarunas.
Last word, maybe from Sarunas and Erin. I think I'm looking forward to that.
Sure.
And then,
Go ahead.
Erin.
Well, I think what your question was about the title, and I think Sarunas had most directly addressed that. I don't know if he wants to explore that any further, but it was just a process, like with any kind of labeling or which is almost impossible, how to encapsulate, right? You're already kind of doing almost a kind of injustice to Ashish's work, but I certainly through the interview was very enlightening, which again that Sarunas had tapped into, and through going through his work and coming to the choices of epistemic archaeology, everyday religion. And we've talked about all of these aspects today. And I think Sarunas tapped into that a little bit more overtly than I did. I don't know if he wants to say something else about that.
Yeah, I mean the title indirectly was inspired by the interview. I mean the epistemic archaeology, that's the term that Ashish used in answering one of our questions. Because we did struggle, we did think a lot about what the title may be, and I mean the diversity of texts in the book and the vastness of the whole cinematic project was such that to put everything in one sentence was quite impossible. But thanks to the interview and thanks to Ashish, we managed to narrow everything down to one single title, which we believe kind of encapsulates everything that is there in the book.
Right, and I will say that the 8 chapters plus the interview, it gives such a good overview, not overview, in fact, in-depth idea of the films that Ashish makes. So great book, good read, and of course we'll have to go looking for Ashish's films. And thank you again. Thanks. I thank the audience also and our guest. And with that, we end today's session. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.